I recently recorded some dialogues with Lucas Vos. We talked about a number of really interesting things, and I brought up a number of topics that I thought I should go into a little bit in more depth. So this is the first of what will probably be a series of videos, short videos where I dive a bit deeper into topics or people that interest me. So the first one is going to be about psi, or I'll explain what that means in a minute, but the study of the paranormal, the scientific study of the paranormal. What evidence do we have for paranormal phenomena? And this came up in a talk with Lucas, which is on both my channel and his. On my channel, it's titled on the Supernatural, Free Will, and the Self. And I will link to the specific part of it that we talk about the subject in the description. Basically, we were talking about, what is the supernatural? Does it actually exist? If it does exist, how does it fit in with nature? And I mentioned that Dean Radin was a researcher who worked on some experiments with random number generators, specifically looking at the question of, can we influence the output of random number generators with our minds? And so very interesting, very controversial topic. So I had a deeper dive into the literature, and I'm going to kind of outline it at a very high level in this video for your interest. So, first of all, in the title for this, I talked about micro-psychokinesis, or micro-PK. I've also mentioned psi. So what do some of these terms actually mean? So psychokinesis is pretty straightforward. Psycho is to do with the mind, and kinesis means movement. And so what this is basically about is the influence of the mind on the world around us, or on matter, the influence of mind on matter, or events, however you want to look at it. When people think about psychokinesis, if they think about it at all, they typically would think about very dramatic macroscopic effects like bending spoons or levitating tables or something like that. Whether or not that type of thing exists is a different question to what we're going to look at here, which is micro-PK, which is much more subtle, much less, I guess you could say, dramatic or theatrical. So one way to look at psychokinesis is to break it up into three different categories. So I've already mentioned macro-PK, psychokinesis on the macroscopic level. That's directly observable effects. You can actually see them, you can actually witness them happening with your senses directly. Another category is bio-PK. So this is effects of the mind on biological systems, on living systems. And finally, what we're going to look at, which is micro-PK, which you could kind of think of as microscopic effects. This is the effects of the mind on inanimate probabilistic systems that are only detectable by statistical means. And I've sort of taken that definition from Varvoglis and Bancel, 2015, and I'll include in my description a list of all the articles that I refer to in this video, and some extra ones as well if you want to dig into the literature. So what does this mean exactly? What do we mean by probabilistic systems? This could be basically anything that is random. So for instance, throwing dice, tossing coins, and then we're looking at random number generators, which are much more truly random and sort of free of subtle influences. There are two types of random number generators: pseudo-random number generators and true random number generators. Pseudo-random number generators basically involve an algorithm that generates a string of numbers, and so in that sense they're not truly random. There is a pattern, there is an algorithm behind it. True random number generators are linked to like actual physical processes that are genuinely random, that are genuinely unpredictable. So that could be things like radioactive decay. It could be forms of noise, thermal noise, atmospheric noise. The idea is that the random number generator will sample the system, and because we genuinely cannot predict what state it's going to be in, the result of that will be truly random. And most of the research on micro-PK has been done with true random number generators. I think that maybe very early on there were a few studies with pseudo-random number generators, but they're not the main thing that we're looking at when we're discussing the results today. I should also mention psi. So I've mentioned psi in introducing this video. That's PSI. That's just a term that on one level refers to the whole discipline, I guess you could say, of scientifically investigating the paranormal. Could be a wide range of different things. It could be psychokinesis, it could be extrasensory perception. There's lots of different things that this could involve. On another level though, it's like the hidden variable that is how psi works, or that is how these paranormal phenomena operate. So for instance, in this case, psi is, whatever is causing, if that's the right language, or whatever enables the random number generator to output non-random numbers, non-random output based on the influence of the human mind. So it's that hidden variable, that hidden thing that is beyond what we currently understand. That's psi. What do these experiments look like? So basically, you've got a random number generator. This is sort of a prototypical experiment. There's lots of different variations of this that have been done. But basically, you've got a random number generator that will generate bits. It will produce either a 1 or a 0 based on that physical system that it is sampling. And you'll have a subject, a participant in a study that will be intending to produce either higher or lower numbers over a predefined number of bits. So for instance, if you generate 100 bits, if it's perfectly random, then 50 is going to be the number that you would expect, but you might get a different number. And if you get a different enough number, then that may be evidence that something is going on beyond just a machine generating random numbers. There might be some sort of influence from the mind. And that's what statistical analysis is for, which we will talk about now. So there's been, many studies done on this. I don't think people realize how many studies have been done on psi phenomena, because it doesn't get too much mainstream attention. And instead of going into specific studies, I'm just going to look at meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are where you get a whole bunch of different studies, and then you kind of combine them together in a sense, and you see, well, what is the overall effect of all these different studies? What's the overall result? That's a simple way of putting it. So there hasn't been a huge amount of meta-analyses. There's been some key ones, which I'm summarizing here. I believe that the Bösch and colleagues one from 2006 is the latest. I haven't seen anything anywhere to suggest there's been a more recent one than that. The first one we'll be looking at is by the researchers Radin and Nelson from 1989. And by then, obviously, as you can see, there's already been a lot of studies done on micro-PK with specifically random number generators. 597 experimental studies were included in this analysis across 68 different researchers. And what they found was a small but highly significant effect. So it's helpful here to distinguish between effect size and statistical significance. So these studies tend to show, there's some exceptions to this, but these studies tend to show a very small effect. So a very small deviation from the value that you would expect to find if it was just truly random. On the other hand, it's a highly significant effect. So when we're talking about effect size, we're talking about the magnitude of the effect, we're talking how big it is. And when we're talking about statistical significance, we're talking about how likely is that effect to just be due to chance alone. And in this case, if you've got a highly statistically significant effect, even if it's small, then that means it's highly unlikely to be just due to chance alone, just a chance variation. And obviously, the more studies you have, the more trials, the more bits, the more you'll be able to detect the statistical significance of a very small effect, because there's more data with which you can say, well, look, this is the natural variations, the expected variations, and this is when things get unusual. And in this case, and in the next one, I'm going to talk about the effects, the significance, the level of significance is astronomical, even though the effect is very small. So that's the first one. There was an updated one that the same researchers did in 2000, and they published this, I believe, in 2003 in a book chapter, which is slight discrepancy between the dates there, but they also collapsed some of the data, I think, and so that's why there's somewhat less studies in that one. But they looked at 515 studies across 91 researchers, and they found basically the same result. Very, very small effect, but a very, very, amazingly highly statistically significant effect. Very, very incredibly unlikely that that effect is just due to some chance variation, just to chance alone. So very, very promising studies for people who believe in, or very promising meta-analyses for people that do believe there is something going on here. And then finally we come to Bösch and colleagues in 2006. And they had more stringent criteria for inclusion, and so that's why they have less studies, 380 experimental studies across 59 researchers. And their analysis is really, really interesting because it's kind of a mixed bag. It's very complicated. First of all, I should say that they did find a significant effect. The effect size was greatly reduced from the already small effect from the previous meta-analyses. But again, it was statistically significant in their final analysis. Another thing that they noted, though, was that the effect sizes across all the different studies that they examined was extremely heterogeneous. So basically what that means is there was a huge variation in effect sizes. Some studies showed really, really big effects. Some studies showed very, very small effects. There was also effects going in different directions. So some studies, instead of showing effects in the direction of the intention of the participants, right, to make the random number generator go higher or lower, instead of getting results that went in the same direction as the intention, or getting results that just prove the null hypothesis, that just were not statistically significant. Some studies actually had results that went in the opposite direction to the intention to a statistically significant degree. So, for instance, if the participants aimed high, then the results would actually go low to a statistically significant degree, more than would just be expected by chance. So it's almost like the results were being sort of deliberately oppositional or something like that. In any case, that just adds complication, it adds complexity to this issue, and it again speaks to the extremely heterogeneous nature of the effect sizes, the nature of the effects that we're seeing here. The other thing that they did find is that the effect size was inversely related to sample size. So basically that means that the larger the sample, the larger the study, the more participants it had, the smaller the effect size. And the smaller studies tended to have larger effects, and the larger ones had smaller effects, which is interesting in itself. And I'll talk about a possible explanation of that in a moment. The other thing about this meta-analysis is it used a couple of different statistical models just to see which one fit best. Didn't quite work out very well. They took the three largest studies out of the analysis and claimed like that was a better analysis. So there's some debate around that as well. Overall, the authors were kind of negative about psi, even though there was a statistically significant result in their final analysis. They, from another further statistical analysis, proposed that this wasn't real, that the effect wasn't real. It wasn't a real psi effect. It was just a result of publication bias, for instance, so that there was more studies being published that were successful, and then other studies just ended up in a file drawer. This is the file drawer effect. So they claimed that based on this model, there would need to be 1,500 unsuccessful studies existing somewhere, or having been run, and that would essentially even out and prove the null hypothesis, and basically show that this significant result isn't due to psi, it's just due to the fact that more studies on showing a positive effect are published than not. There was a lot of controversy around this, both because it suggested that on one level, it suggested that maybe psi is real, maybe there is such a thing as micro-PK. On another level, lots of controversy because it suggested there wasn't such a thing as psi, based on, maybe that this is just the result of publication bias or something like that. So you had, people that were more skeptical coming in and saying, the result is false because of these reasons or those reasons. And then you had the people that actually researched psi coming in and saying, your speculations about publication bias aren't accurate because, the analysis didn't really account for all the heterogeneity of effect sizes, or we've run a different analysis and it gives a different result, which is like an implausibly higher number of unpublished studies that would be needed. So basically, I'm just saying there's a lot of debate around this, but it's really interesting. So just to sort of wrap up, this is my conclusions and some complications to this. So what are we to make of this? So the first thing I'd say is I'd recommend, if you're interested in this, like jumping into the literature, or at least watching a few videos, maybe from both perspectives. I'll link to a video by Dean Radin, who's a prominent researcher in this field, although he's not the only one who has done these experiments. And he's kind of just giving an outline of the different experiments that have been done, the different data, the different reasons there might be to actually believe that psi is a thing, is a real thing. Personally, based on what I've looked at, especially in terms of this stuff, but just in general with psi research, I do think there is a real psi effect here. I think that something is genuinely going on that is beyond what we currently understand about reality or about physics. That the the output of the random number generators in these studies is genuinely being affected somehow by the human mind. I would say that based on what I've read from the studies and the debates that I've read. But I would also say that because it agrees with human experience. And I mean that on two levels. On one level, on the cultural level, pretty much every culture believes in the paranormal in some way or other, and mainly takes it for granted. Of course this exists. Of course there's a lot of variation of what exactly this constitutes, what this looks like, what kind of entities, if any, are in that realm, etc., etc. But the belief in the paranormal is universal, except perhaps in our modern Western culture. The other thing I would say on the second level is that, personal experience. Most people have some experience of paranormal phenomena, something really unusual, really synchronicitous or unlikely happening. And I would say this is, another form of evidence. So if the scientific evidence suggests it, if the evidence of human culture suggests it, and if personal experience suggests this, then I would say on balance it's probably true. And I'm not allergic to the notion that maybe it's all false. I think that's a distinct possibility, but personally I think that's a relatively low probability. Now, the question arises of why the meta-analyses, why the last meta-analysis by Bösch and colleagues was so kind of confusing. There's also been some prominent failures to replicate some key studies as well. So in other words, this is, even though the evidence suggests there's a real psi effect, it's far from clear and it's far from totally determined that there is one. Varvoglis and Bancel in 2016, they propose one explanation for this, and this is the difference between exceptional and universal approaches to studying psi. Exceptional also could be called elitist, because the idea here is that in the former approach, in the exceptional approach, you are selecting participants who are gifted in psi abilities. There was a prominent researcher, Helmut Schmidt, who actually started the studies with random number generators, and he would select his participants. So he would have participants that were either could demonstrate or claim to have paranormal abilities, or he would select them based on sort of screening experiments just to see how successful they would be, and then he used these in his experimental studies. He also was very facilitative in his studies and kind of created a comfortable atmosphere, and so it was less sort of it was the best possible psychological setup as well for them. This contrasts with the larger studies. So I talked before about that inverse relation with the size of the study. So the large studies just tend to recruit anyone who wants to take part. They might not be particularly interested. They might not be particularly motivated. They might not be particularly comfortable. And more importantly, they just might not be particularly gifted at psi. So the question with psi is it universally distributed? Does everyone have roughly the same capabilities when it comes to psi? Or when it comes to, let's say, micro-PK or psychokinesis? Or is it sort of more of an exceptional thing? Some people are extraordinarily gifted, and most people are, maybe they have some trace abilities, but basically they're hardly worth studying because it would take so many people and so many trials to demonstrate an effect. And that's what these authors think, that the later, larger studies, that's the problem that they ran into. So as an example of this, there was a study, really sort of long, multi-year study by Pierre, which was the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, and that was statistically significant. So that was really exciting for people that thought maybe micro-PK exists. And then they were in a consortium after that with, I think it was 2 German institutions. And between them, they ran a replication study, another multi-year study, I believe it was, very similar to the first one. And they actually got a non-significant result. And that's when the skeptics came in and said, well, this just proves that psi isn't real after all. Varvoglis and Bancel analyzed the data of the first peer study, the one that was significant, and actually found there was 2 extreme outliers. So there were 2 participants that contributed a huge portion of the effect, and when you took their contribution out, the effect size was actually quite low and was relatively similar to the effect size that the consortium study, the replication study that came after it produced. And so this actually is good evidence for the model that psi abilities are exceptional, that in any really easily measurable degree, they are only present in certain individuals. And that tends to agree again with culture. I would say it tends to agree with personal experience, and as much as someone has personal experience with this stuff or with people that are prone to this stuff. And so I think that's an interesting and, on the face of it, quite plausible explanation. But at the same time, there do appear to be decline effects, and they seem to maybe go above and beyond just what this explanation can explain. So when I'm talking about decline effects, I'm talking about the tendency for, and this happens particularly in the social sciences, for you get the first study or the first few studies, highly significant results, really exciting, and then after several replications, the effect size either goes down dramatically or even goes down so far that the results are not differentiable from chance. So basically, there's no effect. And so there was a huge thing within the last 10 years, I think it was, around the replication crisis in psychology and the social sciences, and I think this affects medicine as well, where people were finding out that some of these key studies in the disciplines didn't replicate well. So this is a problem that affects a huge swathe of science, not just psi. And in a way, psi has adapted itself to it really well because it's quite experienced with it. But in any case, looking at the literature, and I won't go into detail here, there do appear to be decline effects. There's an overall decline effect from the earlier studies by Helmut Schmidt to current studies. In terms of the effect size, just goes down, and the results become less significant, or it's more likely to get non-significant results in your studies. And there's decline effects within sort of like individual series of studies. So a researcher might do a series of 2 or 3 studies, and the second one and the second and third one might be replications of the first, and they might find that the first gets extraordinary results, and then maybe the second gets mediocre results, and then maybe the third gets really bad results that show there's no effect. So this is itself a really interesting phenomenon. There's different ways to account for it. The obvious one would just be that there is no effect. There's lots of talk in the social sciences in terms of, well, what's causing these decline effects, and what's behind the replication crisis, and how do we prevent this? So there's things like pre-registering studies so that the results are reported regardless of what the outcome is, or journals just accepting studies based on like the setup for them rather than based on the results. And there's a whole lot of stuff. I think that Bayesian statistics is being used more now because it's considered more reliable. And so there's lots of ways that scientists have used to try and get around this problem. From what I've seen, though, none are entirely successful, only partially successful, and none entirely explain the problem. And so psi actually, maybe psi isn't true. Maybe there's a whole lot of methodological issues here that also affect other scientific disciplines. That's one possibility. Psi actually presents its own kind of explanation for both the decline effects in psi and in social science, though, which, to put it really simply, is that there's a kind of experimenter effect. The experimenter exerts his or her psi on the study because he or she expects good results, or results that accord with their hypotheses. So the first studies are really good, and then the following studies are bad. Another way to explain it, though, and I won't go into depth in this because I want to keep this video relatively short, but von Lucadou has a model of pragmatic information. It talks about micro-PK in terms of entanglement correlations, and it basically says that because of the nature of quantum entanglement, signals can't be transferred, and therefore it's expected that you would get significant results in your first studies, and then that would gradually dissipate, because if you could get a robust and replicable evidence of psi, you could use it to transfer signals via entanglement, which violates the nature of entanglement. So I'll say dive into that article if you're interested in that. And so one consequence of that, though, is that the less objective the experiment, the more psychokinesis or psi in general should be present, should be detectable. So in Deschamps and Radin, their article in 2023, they talk about this in depth. And again, look at that article if you're interested. So it may be that by its very nature, psi may elude totally objective scientific study. It may be that when you try and study it like just purely physical, like a purely physical thing, with the standards of physics, with the objective standards of physics, then it disappears, or it eludes us in some way based on its very nature. So this might sound like a slippery argument. This might sound like psi researchers just trying to give an explanation for their, null results or complicated results. But there are ways you can study this. And in that study by Deschamps and Radin that I talked about, they actually do try and study this, and they get some promising results. Because there's ways you can set up experiments where, even though the testing of psi is less objective, you can kind of mitigate that and balance that in some way. So yeah, I mean, I think this is probably true. It accords again with experience, which is to say that when things that may be paranormal, or that things that seem to go beyond ordinary experience happen, they tend to be entwined with subjective meaning, subjective psychological state, and so on and so forth. And so there is that kind of entanglement in the non-physical sense, entanglement, but so the enmeshing of the subject and the object, that just seems to be part of the nature of this. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. But, maybe the whole thing doesn't exist. It's possible. Personally, I think it's unlikely. What do you think? Or if you haven't looked at this, maybe you want to dive in to the literature and see what you do think. And I think I'll also link to, there's a website that you can use to generate random numbers, and it's based on a true random number generator, so it's linked to a truly random physical process. It's not just an algorithm. For fun, maybe you want to play around with that. Maybe you want to see, if you generate a long string of numbers, how many you're going to get that are random versus how many you're going to guess correctly. Obviously, probably not a very stringent study, but could be interesting. And maybe you'll find out that you have some psi or micro-PK abilities. But that's it for me today. Thank you for listening.